So most of Sudan's gold now is being exported legally or illegally through the UAE onto global markets. And Egypt is basically a beggar state that is unable to really shape the region. It went from one of the big leading countries in the 20th century of the Middle East into a beggar state. They had asked a very infamous gentleman called Eric Prince to set up shop in the Emirates. Very few people in Egypt now think that the coup of 2013 by Sisi was a good thing for Egypt, right?
What would have happened to Sudan specifically if the UAE weren't funding the Janjaweed for the last 15 years?
But the Emiratis are the spoilers in all of that. They don't want a consolidated Yemen. They would prefer two Yemens and one that's fully under Abu Dhabi influence. And obviously the UAE being implicated in that because they're the main financial and military and logistical backer of the RSF.
Are we rolling? Okay, good.
That's off the record.
Yeah, no, it's, no, it's not. It's just because sometimes we use these cutaways in the first 30 seconds of the show. Cool. Okay, are we good to go? Okay. I'm going to clap. Hi, good day, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaq Karim, and I'm very pleased today to have in studio Andreas Krieg. Andreas, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Andreas is no stranger to people who follow Middle East Eye, either on text. He's also appeared in a few of our shows. He's a columnist for us. He's an associate professor at King's College. His expertise is really understanding and thinking about the Middle East, its actors, its ideas, and he's one of the foremost scholars in that. Andreas, I'm very excited to have you here with us today. As we were just getting into the lift, as he was kind of coming up to our studios, he asked me, what do you want to cover? Because it sounds very broad from the notes I sent him. And it is broad. It's an interesting discussion for those of you who are interested in what we are about to speak about, because really we're unpacking the last 15 years of the Arab region, but through the prism of the UAE statecraft. So we're going to touch on Sudan, which people may have, there's obviously two types of people seeing the show: those who are quite familiar with the subject matter and those who are interested but not yet so sure. So I think many people have heard about the UAE's kind of backing of the rebels in Sudan and what occurred with that, but the story starts way before that, right? So if you were telling the story, where would you start?
Where would I start? You probably have to start in the mid-2000s, really, because the UAE today is a country that is run by, it's a family business run by Abu Dhabi's royal family, the Al Nahyan, and most specifically the Bani Fatima, which is Mohammed, who's the president, Mohammed bin Zayed, Tahnoun bin Zayed, the national security advisor, and Mansour bin Zayed. These three in particular, they're kind of the key actors in the UAE, and their rise to power really shaped what the UAE is today, because the UAE, or Abu Dhabi more specifically, hasn't been such an assertive player in the region or even in the Gulf up until really the rise of Mohammed bin Zayed and his brothers into power in the early mid-2000s. And so Mohammed bin Zayed's rise through the ranks of the military into the position that he is in today as the president of the United Arab Emirates, that kind of journey is also the journey of the UAE from a small state, somewhat under the umbrella and shadow of Saudi Arabia, into, I would argue, probably the most agile and also most assertive country in this part of the world, and I would probably even say the most powerful country, even when compared to Israel, and not because they're necessarily quite big or because they have a big GDP or because they have a big population. They have obviously financial wealth, which is important, but they have understood a way, for good or for bad, how to translate financial power and what the nation has to offer into influence in the world, not just regionally, but definitely regionally, but also globally. I mean, they're a global player, and I would say they probably have elevated themselves from being this kind of small state in the Gulf to a regional middle power.
So, you've said that they possibly have more power even than Israel. The other big actor is Saudi Arabia, especially right now. That's going to probably... we are going to spend the next 2 hours sort of unpacking why that's the case. But that's probably quite, like, for people listening to this and they think, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, it's these flashy cities that we started off as small little backwaters in the 70s, and now that's grown up. I think specifically before we actually, I think part of painting this picture is just getting to just how sinister some of the actions of the UAE have been in the last 15 years. You've written an article for us, an opinion column, where you speak about how they've set up sort of an axis of secessionist actors. And so you speak about these things, and what we want to get to is the UAE in many ways are responsible for vast parts of the instability in Libya, Yemen, Sudan, and others. How did and why did it go from this place that was, this nice building all these islands and attracting capital and westernizing superficially to this kind of actor? And just explain that to us, but also give us an idea of just how sinister and devastating their actions have been with regards to this.
Well, obviously, making a value judgment of whether something is sinister or not is quite subjective.
It's true.
So you ask the Emiratis about it. The one thing they will always come back as an explanation, legitimizing what they're doing, is the word istiqrar, which is stability. They always come back saying this is about stability, which is kind of paradoxical if you think of the consequences of Emirati intervention in Libya, in Yemen, and obviously in Sudan and elsewhere, which, most people in those countries would say actually has been kind of detrimental for regional and local stability because it has undermined stability. The UAE's intent is one thing. I think the UAE under Mohammed bin Zayed, who as a leader has shaped the country into what they are today, looks at the region through a prism of threat and insecurity. So it's a very deep-seated insecurity, inferiority complex through which they analyzed the region, and they saw the development, especially after the Arab Spring, as a sort of development that could undermine the regime's security in Abu Dhabi. They saw the rise of civil society and the rise up of civil society winning against the authoritarian, autocratic regimes, of the ancien regimes, if you will, of the Arab world. They saw this as a fundamental threat to their own regime's legitimacy. And so they have seen, unlike other countries, I mean, Qatar is the polar opposite of that. Obviously, they looked at what happened during the Arab Spring as an opportunity. They thought this is an opportunity to change the dynamics, socio-political dynamics in the region. The Emiratis saw this counter, quite polar opposite. So this is a fundamental threat to their regime security. And so what they did, why they did what they did, is because they don't like, and that's when I say they, it's Mohammed bin Zayed in particular, and his brothers do not like the unpredictability of civil societal mobilization. And it's not just the revolutionary end of that, because that's what they focused on in 2010, 11, and so on. It's everything. It starts with them with, what happens in the mosque, where people meet and have discourse that is socially relevant, potentially politically relevant, goes into, what happens on social media, goes into general, journalism. It goes into any sort of discourse that could potentially, implant the seeds of future mobilization that could, in its extreme form, lead to some sort of revolution. And that's how the UAE, how Abu Dhabi looks at civil societal mobilization. It's a fundamental threat to regime security, and it's something that they want to suppress in its earliest form. It started initially at home. It really started in 2010 as a clampdown on civil society in the United Arab Emirates, particularly in Abu Dhabi, but then later on in the other 6 Emirates. And then they exported this across the region into other countries, Libya being the first one that had to experience this sort of counter-revolutionary push. Later on, they exported into Yemen, into Egypt as well in 2013, after where they were very instrumental in the coup d'état against the then Muslim Brotherhood government of Morsi, where they backed the military taking back power. And so there is a pattern that evolved. So we have Libya. So probably we should start with Egypt 2013, moving to Libya, going to Yemen, and now obviously Sudan and everything in between.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, that's where I wanted to get to. You said why they did what they did. Let's start unpacking what they did. I mean, we're also going to, just so that we can kind of let the audience know what we're about to speak about, is once we get through this, starting with Egypt and then Libya and then Yemen and Sudan, we're going to obviously speak about the genocide that's been unfolding and how that repositions the UAE, and then discuss the bigger discussion, I guess, of the US. I'm not sure if it's complicity or guardianship or allyship in this project.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because we've been hearing the US presidents for the last 25 years have all been saying since George Bush's war in Iraq, that we need to start focusing less on the Middle East and more on China. And they have started to focus more on China, but they haven't stopped focusing on the Middle East.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to get to where that. But I mean, yes, Egypt. What was Abu Dhabi's counter-revolutionary activity, and what did they do?
So in 2011, the Emiratis and the Qataris were asked by the UK and other NATO countries whether they would support the NATO operation in Libya. That's really when the Emiratis were asked to kind of contribute.
So we're speaking about Libya first.
Well, Libya is really where the Arab Spring begins. Nothing happened in 2011 that 100%. Would really help the counter-revolutionary narrative to unravel. But in 2011, this small state, Abu Dhabi, was thinking, okay, there is an opportunity to be part of shaping this future. They weren't quite sure yet in 2011 where it would end. They didn't know it would be, that you would have civil society overpowering and toppling all these regimes. They also didn't understand necessarily that political Islam would play a strong role in it, and that these Islamist organizations in these countries, who had been for decades already the only opposition on the ground, that they would play an outsized role, if you will, in remodeling the future, socio-political future of the Arab world. So in 2011, they entered the Arab Spring because they wanted to be relevant to the West, and it was really just about Libya. But what happened from 2011 until 2013 is really where, especially 2012, where they realized that, where this insecurity complex really kicked in, where they realized, okay, the Qataris are in the driver's seat. The Qataris had all these relationships with different non-state actors and also different Islamic groups and Islamist groups across the region. They were involved in shaping the outcome of the Syrian civil war. They were involved in Egypt, where they had a relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. They were involved in shaping the political climate in Libya as well, in Tunisia, and so on and so forth. So there's always been that rivalry between Qatar and the UAE over, who's going to lead. They're in some ways quite similar because they're neighbors. They're deep-seated, tribal issues that go back decades and centuries. But essentially, there's a bit of rivalry going on there. But beyond that rivalry, I think the Emiratis then realized in 2012 how dangerous the new order that was emerging could become. So in 2012, we had got the Muslim Brotherhood and their candidate Morsi being elected as the president of Egypt. And that was a massive shocking moment for the Emiratis, because they realized, okay, the population-wise biggest Arab country is now ruled by someone that they consider to be the arch enemy of political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood. The fear of the Muslim Brotherhood in Abu Dhabi also has to be understood against the context that, unlike other Gulf states, the Muslim Brotherhood had a sort of a network that reached all the way into the UAE. So they were the Muslim Brotherhood had created sort of a base within the UAE through decades of providing people who came to Abu Dhabi to build the state, to build the bureaucracy, to build the education sector. These were all individuals, and not all, but there were a lot of individuals who had relationships with Muslim Brotherhood. So they were involved in building the Emirati state. We had some locals who subscribed to the ideology of social political change and reform through the form of Islam. So there was a reform movement in the UAE that had a relationship to the Muslim Brotherhood. Al-Islah, the kind of reform movement, was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood, whatever happened in Egypt, which for the Emiratis was kind of the mothership of this network in the region, had a direct impact on mobilization in the UAE. So and you had one of these Muslim brothers now becoming the president of Egypt in 2012, with direct ramifications for Emiratis who had subscribed to the same ideology. So they saw what happened in Egypt, as a direct threat to regime security. And so we see that clampdown in 2011 already on the Muslim Brotherhood, and further clampdowns on the Muslim Brotherhood in the years to come. And as in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power in 2012, the UAE identified the Muslim Brotherhood as the greatest threat to national security, clamping down on any sort of civil societal group that had any link to political Islam, and even those who had any link to Islam whatsoever. So it's a very broad brush. I mean, until today, I don't think there's any country, including Israel, that uses the Muslim Brotherhood scarecrow and boogeyman to the extent that the Emiratis do it. I mean, for the Emiratis, if they want to smear and slander someone, they will say, he's a guy, he's Muslim Brotherhood, or she's Muslim Brotherhood, in the same way that now the Israelis are saying this guy is Hamas and this guy is Hamas. This is, kind of how the Emiratis started this war against the Muslim Brotherhood. And so in Egypt in 2012, big shocking moment, and they put a lot of effort behind trying to topple that regime. And obviously Muslim Brotherhood government, haunted by decades of mismanagement and inferiority complex, were very, very cynical about, and possibly rightly so, cynical about the Egyptian military and where the Egyptian military was going, and were fearful. And what the Muslim Brotherhood then created in Egypt was a regime that in itself wasn't just. didn't live up to the standards and to their objectives, and created something that for many Egyptians wasn't what they voted for in 2012, and was certainly not something that they went to the streets for in 2011. And so what the Emiratis were seeing, they saw a potential to drive a wedge into the social political relations in Egypt by saying, we can actually try to disrupt political discourse in Egypt to create a rift between the government run by the Muslim Brotherhood and the people of Egypt. And so they engaged with a liberal secular group in northern Egypt at the time, the Tamarud, which were, they wanted a secular liberal Egypt. They thought their ambitions weren't accomplished during the revolution. They didn't like the Muslim Brotherhood. They were a very small group in 2012, and then between 2012 and late 2012 and June 2013, they grew into this massive movement, being able to obviously draw on the various grievances that Egyptians had, and were able to bring people to the street. And what we see here is that the Emiratis were kind of strategically engaging with media companies, with social media companies, to kind of spread, weaponized narratives about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in during that period in late 2012, early 2013, and were able to contribute to a counter mobilization to the Muslim Brotherhood that led to the events in June 2013, where you had nearly 1 million people on the streets protesting against the government, and thereby also, obviously, there's a lot of evidence for how the Emiratis then engaged and, build relationships with the military intelligence, and kind of creating the pretext for the military to stage the coup, Sisi at the time, staging the coup against Morsi in June 2013. So the Emiratis become very instrumental in that, instrumental in building these counter networks to the Muslim Brotherhood, instrumental in shaping perception in Egypt, instrumental globally to ostracize the Muslim Brotherhood and talking it down, and were then, through their relationship with the Egyptian military, able to create a pretext that would lead to a change of regime within Egypt, the most populous country in the Arab world. So that was an eye-opening moment to Abu Dhabi, saying, actually, we might be small, but our financial power, if curated, orchestrated, and delivered strategically, we can actually achieve quite something. We can, punch way above our weight and change social politics in the region. They realized in 2013 there was a moment where the revolution could be turned into a counter-revolution. And that's that's where this unfolds, where the counter-revolutionary ambition of the Emirates, of Abu Dhabi in particular, unfolds. So they win in Egypt, obviously Qatar being the big loser. We see a change, handover of power in Qatar from the father emir to Tamim, which also meant that Qatar became far less activist as they were in previous years. And a vacuum was left in the Arab Spring, as the Arab Spring was anyway not necessarily delivering for a whole host of different reasons. People were fearing that their grievances weren't addressed. And the Emiratis were very good at exploiting these grievances and curating networks, running against the revolution and saying, we need to go back to what they say, quote unquote, stability, which is going back to some sort of, a regional order where authoritarians can control and contain what civil society is doing.
Okay, so I mean, you mentioned that the status quo has been in the region, and this goes back to for many years. Authoritarian regimes, who, if you go back for the last 70 years, were either anti or pro USA, and both sort of the pro USA sort of allyship, bank on the USA for security, and sort of the anti, so to speak about them. So the theocracies in Iran, Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, anti-USA. They get their power from stamping down on suppression and dictatorship, and their power comes from allyship back in the Cold War to the USSR. But just coming back, I mean, I've just mentioned that so that the audience gets an idea of the relationship between authoritarianism and stability that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Now there's people hearing this, and they'd be like, there were 3 million people in the streets. By some estimates, I mean, the news would falsely report there were 17 million or 33 million. Those numbers were definitely not there, but it's between 1 million and 3 million people on the streets in Cairo in 2013. Could the Emiratis have mobilized 3 million people? Were they acting alone? Were they acting with the Saudis and the Israelis? And so let's discuss that, but then also their actions later on in Libya and Yemen and Sudan, move away from just mobilizing societies to being a lot more militaristic, and supply chains and those kind of things. So there's a big shift. So first address, how could, is it feasible that the Emiratis, this tiny state, could mobilize these Egyptians? And maybe this is just wishful thinking. Just clarify because I'm guessing it's a nuanced answer, but then how they pivot from that to, running militias.
Yeah, so obviously running a civil societal mobilization and influence is a network. It's a networked activity, right? It's not linear. It's very, you don't know how it's going to unfold. A lot of things had to happen for it to be successful in 2013. Obviously, it wouldn't have been able, the Emiratis wouldn't have been able to do it without the help of the Egyptian military. They wouldn't have been able to do it without compromising certain elites in Egypt. They wouldn't have been, and financially compromising them. They wouldn't have been able to do it without protesters being directly paid by proxies of the UAE. And obviously, ideologically speaking, the fear of the Muslim Brotherhood is not just an Emirati fear. I mean, the other actor in the Middle East that didn't want the Arab Spring to succeed was obviously Israel. I mean, the Israelis have always seen the quote-unquote Arab street as being irrational, emotional, and certainly anti-Israel. And that was a threat to, and has been a threat to Israeli security since the creation of Israel. So the Israelis had certainly a vested interest in making sure that the Emiratis succeed in this. And that's that fear of the Arab street, the fear of the Muslim Brotherhood, the fear of political Islam, the fear of sort of freed, emancipated Arabs thinking freely and acting freely, being able to vote and their voices being heard, is like the antithesis to stability in the mind of the Israelis. So they certainly had an interest in that. But I would say a lot of things came together in that summer of 2013, and Emirati money was the key. The Emiratis were key in the orchestration of it. So as I said, it's a networked activity. A lot of different things have to happen. It's not like sort of people think like, the conspiracy theories. There's like Mohammed bin Zayed is paying directly checks and he making phone calls and whatnot. Obviously, it's not like that. There's a lot of intermediaries and proxies that were paid for by the Emiratis for them to be able to do this. And the Egyptian military and the Egyptian security services were a very instrumental part in this, who were compromised and obviously had an interest to cooperate with the Emiratis. But why I think the Emiratis were the mastermind behind it is because they had a clear vision. Nobody else at the time had a clear vision of how to change the regional order, and that includes the Obama administration as well. I think it's very important to bear in mind. We always say, the Americans wanted to do this and that. I mean, the US didn't have a clear vision for the Arab world. We are talking about a period where the United States already was in a state of gradual withdrawal from the Middle East, right? The pivot towards Asia, where obviously the US hasn't succeeded. I mean, we're talking about it later on, but nonetheless, the idea was, let's delegate this issue of regional security to local proxies. And the local proxies that were there traditionally have been the Israelis, obviously, but also increasingly the Gulf states, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. And this hasn't changed until today. So over the last 12 years, we've seen the Americans doubling down on this disengagement and working through proxies and partners such as the Gulfies and also Israel. So it's, they might have a shared vested interest, but it's really the Emiratis who were the ones who knew how to fill that vacuum at the time in 2013, and they succeeded. And the confidence that came from it, the confidence that you can use, and that's what strategy, what is it all about? Strategy is about creating power out of what is available to yourself. How can you use what is available to yourself and translating that into influence? And the Emiratis had found a way to do this. And obviously most of what they had available to themselves were financial resources. And they found a way to translate these resources into power, into strategic depth. And hence what happened afterwards, the moving into Libya in 2014, not even a year after, followed the same playbook, where again, you had someone with an authoritarian tendency, someone again in uniform, Haftar, General Khalifa Haftar, who was an old Gaddafi-era field marshal, I think he calls himself, failed military leader, but someone who had links with the CIA, someone who had American citizenship, someone who would be palatable to the American audiences in Washington, who also was promising, like Sisi, to bring back stability and saying, actually, if you want stability, you need to crush some eggs. The idea that, if what happens, obviously what 2013 was initially about mobilizing the people, in order to create an opening that then could be exploited by the military. But what you're essentially creating is a military dictatorship that contains freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and also any sort of form of civil societal association and mobilization. And the same sort of playbook was then played out in Libya, I think it was also in June 2014. It was nearly a year later, where they had engaged. So Haftar was tried to stage a coup on YouTube, I think, on the 14th of February 2014. Some people call it the coup of Valentine's Day or something like that. Yeah, and it didn't succeed. It was extremely poorly done. He clearly didn't have any support. Nobody watched that video. It was a video he put on YouTube saying, calling for the overthrow of what he called the Islamist government. But certainly, I think this coup triggered the Emiratis to pay attention and say, who's this guy? Is he a potential ally that we can work with? And so hence they did. And we see from February till June 2014, we see this entire campaign professionalizing. And again, that's not just Emirati money, but it's also orchestration, networking, connecting Haftar to the right people. Money obviously did play a role, and giving him the sort of advice that he needed to make much more of a professional approach at overthrowing the government, which he then framed, I think, Operation Dignity, and trying to overthrow the government. He didn't succeed, and he tried again in 2019. He didn't succeed. But what he did succeed in doing, unlike in Egypt 2013, where Sisi was able to seize the state and the regime, Haftar was able to seize half of Libya, a very sizable chunk of Libya, and one that is extremely lucrative for a variety of different reasons, mostly because for oil and gas. And he was able to use sectarian thinking within Libya, because obviously Libya has traditionally been divided into three regions, the Fezzan, Tripolitania, and Cyrenaica. And using Cyrenaica mentality and mindset as a form to mobilize people around Haftar, to allow him to create a military dictatorship effectively that acts as a sub-state actor in Libya, and followed the same playbook. Didn't achieve as much in terms of strategic depth, but it has certainly created a foothold for the Emiratis that nobody can push them away from.
Okay, so I think, the key to understanding interference, right, and whether it's a positive or a negative, or why it's harmful, why it's not harmful, is trying to imagine what the opportunity cost of these non-interventions would have been. Right. So it's we can leave that all for later, but I think as we're telling the story, we need kind of some interjections. Yeah. Right. So just how, because there's been people listening to this, and they'll be skeptical of the Muslim Brotherhood as well. How could we tell that the Muslim Brotherhood, maybe they wouldn't have been as dictatorial as Sisi, but it wasn't going to be this democratic revolution which the people asked for anyway, right? And Libya seemed to be a country which was obviously, because of the war that starts when the NATO sort of comes in and Gaddafi is killed, which we have to remember starts again as an organic uprising to Gaddafi. It's not entirely interference. Interference definitely plays a role in fomenting a civil war, but would Libya be in civil war anyway? These are just sort of things so we can understand the opportunity cost that has occurred because of the interventions, right, the Emiratis.
Yes. So going back to Egypt, my alternative history, right? What if had Sisi, had Morsi stayed in power? Which direction would the government have taken? A Muslim Brotherhood government? We don't know. What we can say, though, is that because of the very deeply seated, inferiority complex that the Muslim Brotherhood had, being a suppressed sort of opposition group, is they were paranoid about everyone and anything. So they took themselves, being on the receiving end of it, they took some steps in early 2013 that made them look increasingly authoritarian as well, because they wanted to, level the playing field, making sure that the intelligence and also the military is not trying to take that power away from them. They really wanted to consolidate power, and that consolidation process was certainly not one that, you would say, oh, that's a very liberal democratic approach. We don't know if that power that Morsi accumulated in 2013, whether that power would ever have been surrendered again to the public. We don't know that. Maybe not. So I'm not saying without intervention, Egypt would have been much, much better off. We don't know that. But we certainly would have had more of an opportunity for discourse to happen, more opportunity for potential mobilization also against the Muslim Brotherhood that could have led not to a coup by the military. And I think any sort of military intervention is like is into politics always leads to terrible outcomes. I mean, it creates short-term stability, but long-term it kind of destroys countries. And so that's what we're seeing. I think there's very few people in Egypt now think that the coup of 2013 by Sisi was a good thing for Egypt, right? It wasn't efficient. When military people do authoritarianism, they do it 100%. They go full in. And that's what we've seen. I mean, this sort of police state that Sisi has created, second to none. He has been able to subvert not just the military, but he's subverted military intelligence, the intelligence services, Ministry of Interior, to where now the regime is just about self-preservation. It's all about making sure we don't succumb to any sort of pressure internally or externally. And Egypt is basically a beggar state that is unable to really shape the region. It went from one of the big leading countries in the 20th century of the Middle East into a beggar state that has to go begging at the doors of Qatar, Saudi, UAE for money. I don't think it would have been that bad had, whatever direction Egypt would have taken. On Libya, yes, I mean, the revolutions are messy, right? And political transitions are messy. I can't think of any. Yeah, probably what happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall in Eastern Europe was probably an example of transition that was fairly smooth. Because there'd been a little bit of, there were European countries embracing another European ideology. But the problem with the Arab world was that, you can't just inject a Western idea of democracy and say, oh, that's the form of governance that works for you. That would have been some form of colonial imposition. So the process of revolution should have had a process of political theory and political consolidation in there, where you think, what is the best form of governance for us? It wouldn't have been necessarily a Western liberal democratic model. Could have been any other sort of model. I personally am of the opinion that actually some form of constitutional monarchy might be the best form of governance for this part of the world. But it's for regional actors to determine that. And so in that process of determining what is the best form of governance, that's a messy process. And Libya it came out of the civil war into relative stability. But that formation, that consolidation process that was in full swing in Libya was completely undermined by the Emirati intervention in 2014. And Haftar since has been the greatest obstacle to actually, consensus building in the country, and also building what the Emiratis were claiming they wanted to, which is building stability.
I think, tell us more about Haftar. Tell us more about how, UAE money, firstly, how is that money given to him? What did he use it for? And just how he's consolidated the state and how that's made Libya, well, it's not a congruent state anymore. But just tell us more about Haftar, because I think that's key to understanding the type of actors, and we'll get there when we speak about the RSF and who the UAE has funded in Yemen. But just sort of tell us the style and type of kind of consolidation he's consolidated.
No, Khalifa Haftar's consolidation follows the same playbook, as I said, like Sisi. Consolidation of power, authoritarianism. He's creating a mukhabarat state, as we say in Arabic, which is based on intelligence services, very repressive. People, if you're not with me or against me, people are being disappeared. So extremely repressive. It's not really Emirati money that much that made the difference on the ground. I mean, Libya is a very rich country. Libya has its own ways of generating money. But the Emiratis were able to help. The Emiratis have, and I think that's their greatest source of power, by the way, is the network of networks of corporate entities that can provide any sort of service that's relevant for statecraft, from logistics, commodity trading, oil trading, mercenarism, providing private security, and basically all the capacities of state that you would expect a mature middle or great power to have. All these capacities the Emiratis have been curating and building through private commercial networks. And these commercial networks were offered to Haftar, from logistics that obviously allows Haftar to fly troops back and forth, that allow the Emiratis to bring in weapons into Libya, which is extremely important over the years. Consulting advise in the, how do you build a state in terms of political consultancy, again, supported and they were introduced to by the Emiratis. We have oil trade, again, very important to actually keep the Benghazi government in eastern Libya alive. Was only possible because of Emirati support. We see, the Emirati oil firms coming in and supporting them. Hooking Haftar up with diplomatic contacts outside of the UAE, because that's another important part. I mean, the UAE is a very well connected country. So using their connectivity to Russia, for example, that Russia Haftar link, extremely important, even way before Wagner Group comes in 2019. We see Haftar already reaching out to the Russians. That's an introduction the Emiratis made for him. So they give him diplomatic cover. They give him legitimacy. The Emiratis obviously allow the training. They provide training for their armed forces or their security sector, whatever you want to call it, for the militias, consolidating those, giving them arms, training them. And so everything that we in the UK or the United States would have as in-house capability that we offer in terms of development to our partners, the Emiratis are offering this through corporate entities and corporate networks, because the Emirates is a state bloated but doesn't do very much. I mean, as other Gulf states as well, they're not very efficient in terms of statecraft and governance. Where they are efficient is where they draw on the market, and they have really opened their jurisdiction up to attract the sort of companies that then could be lend out or provided to their partners, and that's what they've done. And Haftar, in the course of that, has been able to build a parallel security sector of militias, a network of militias, which he calls the Libyan National Army. It's not Libyan, it's not national, and it's not an army, because I'm saying it's not Libyan because there's a lot of people from the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa who are serving in it, mercenaries. It's not national because it doesn't represent the nation of Libya. I mean, if at all, it represents the eastern part of Libya. And it's not an army because in the end of the day, it's a very loose network of brigades that are spread all over eastern Libya, and each brigade fights for themselves, basically. So it's really not what we consider to be an army, but it has the monopoly over violence, if you will, in the eastern part of Libya. And obviously in 2019 they used that network in another second attempt to capture Tripoli, and they failed, which was a very, very dangerous moment, because had Tripoli fallen into the hands of the LNA, Haftar would have been he would have been in a position to claim that he's now the legitimate representative of Libya, which he's not. I think it's quite important to understand that the Western community, the US, Europe, do not acknowledge Haftar as a partner to do business with, and they still support the UN-backed process. But the Europeans and the Americans have withdrawn from Africa anyway. They back whoever they think can win. I think if Haftar been successful in 2019, I think the West would have rallied around him and said, okay, now that's the new status quo, we'll accept it. And it was very important I think it's important for Libya that he didn't win, and that the process is still a sort of dual process, with Haftar being the most powerful partner and player in the region, in the country, but not the only one. So he has to still compromise. And obviously Haftar now is old, but he's built a regime that is very much built around his family. His two sons are running most of the businesses. And again, when we say the Emiratis are renting out their businesses or businesses based in the UAE to their partners, it also means that these businesses then build relationships with other businesses on the ground. And so you create already a nepotistic authoritarian network between a regime on the ground, in this case Haftar, and the UAE as a partner as the sort of patron of that in that relationship.
Final question, and then we'll move away from Libya. But I think this is key to also understanding the situation. What's Western Libya like? How are they propped up, and how are they supported, and how did they ensure that Haftar's charge on Tripoli in 2019 was not successful?
No, Western Libya, debate. I mean, that's the other interesting bit.
The term Western Libya itself is problematic, but I mean, just to simplify.
Sure. I mean, Tripoli obviously has its own government, which is the UN-backed government. It's the one that everyone engages with when they say we're engaging with Libya. The funny thing is, it looks fairly binary. I mean, for the last 10 years or so, people have looked at Libya through a binary lens of saying, okay, there's Benghazi versus Tripoli, and it is binary. It looks binary, but for the Emiratis, it's not that binary. They've also built a relationship with a lot of figures in, whether these are leaders of certain militia groups in Western Libya, but also built relationship with Dbeibeh and other prime ministers and political figures in Western Libya as well. And this is where the Emiratis, again, that's where they're much better than other countries, and especially other Gulf countries, is the fact that they have this, I don't want to call it pragmatism, but they have this sort of sense of spreading their wings and spreading their networks as widely as possible, casting the net as broadly as they possibly can, in case Haftar was to lose, then they still have a potential backup that they can engage with. And we see that in Sudan, for example. We also see this in Yemen. Because these are corporate ways of engaging, the market drives much of it. So these are private corporations that find ways into Eastern and Western Libya. They don't look at Libya in a binary way. But Western Libya now is, it's both sides are fairly stable, but Western Libya is far less repressive. In a way that, there isn't a Mukhabarat state that would go after people, chopping people's heads off. There aren't any tribal militia that are being used as a Praetorian Guard, as this is the case in Benghazi, where Haftar is using a Praetorian Guard of Madkhalis in particular, who are, very, very radical. It's a very, very strange thing to say, but they're basically very radical Sufis who go in and basically use violence to really suppress any form of opposition. That doesn't exist in Western Libya. So Western Libya is, I wouldn't call it a liberal democracy by Western standards, obviously, but it doesn't matter. It's still something where I do think it has transitioned more naturally to a form of, non-authoritarian governance than Eastern Libya has.
Let's move on to, I guess, the next logical stop would be Yemen, not Sudan, even though interference with Sudan starts from a long time ago. Yes. But we'll catch that up later. So, and again, the interference in Yemen starts pretty soon after 2011. So just, what's the story in Yemen?
Well, the story in Yemen, right. I mean, Yemen, we have also, an uprising. Ali Abdullah. Yemen is far more of it was never a consolidated authoritarian regime as the one of Mubarak was or Gaddafi was. It was far less centralized. Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was the strongman, was not really overthrown. I mean, he remained in power, but we have a process of a national dialogue where different Yemeni factions come together in 2012. Also, due to the pressure of the street, he's trying to make some concessions. Yemen is an extremely divided country, not just north versus south, but you have, you get the highlands, you get the lowlands, you get the Hadramaut in the east, you get Mahra, you have a variety of different provinces who have their own sort of identity and character. And because of the geographic obstacles, it was a country that always very difficult to unite. And obviously for many decades in the 20th century, Yemen was a separated country. There was a northern Yemen and a southern Yemen. But all of these fault lines that existed obviously came out after the revolution in 2011, 2012. And one actor that has been a bit of a nuisance already pre-Arab Spring were obviously the Houthis in the north, who, are Shia Zaydis, who are, have tried to find ways to reinstate a monarchy based on the monarchy, the imamat that ruled Yemen for quite some time. And so we see the Houthis, becoming more and more active, also vis-a-vis the Saudis, and they're becoming more and more of a nuisance. Obviously capturing Sana'a in 2014, which was a big turning point for the region, because after all, Yemen isn't far away. It's not a conflict of choice like Libya or Egypt, because Yemen was right in Arabia. It's right on their doorstep. And so the Saudis becoming increasingly worried about what's going on there. And we have a change of government in 2015 in Saudi Arabia as well, with Salman becoming king, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, then taking over as defense minister. A new emergent figure, nobody really heard about him outside of the kingdom. And he tried to make a name for himself, and he decides in March 2015, we have to go to war in Yemen to oust the Houthis from Sana'a and push them back into the mountains. And at this point, obviously, Saudi Arabia is a highly invested country in Yemen. There isn't a faction within Yemen that the Saudis haven't done business with before. So they've engaged with people in the Hadramaut, people in Mahra, people in the south, people in the north, royalists, socialists. There's literally not a faction within this, rig-rag of different entities within Yemen that the Saudis hadn't engaged with at this point, including, by the way, the royalists, which were the predecessors of the Houthis. This war obviously doesn't have a strategic end game. The Saudis are saying we're going to bomb them back. It's going to be a matter of weeks. We're going to bomb the Houthis back into the mountains, and then Yemen will be free again. And that doesn't happen. So after a month, quite clearly, the air campaign, which was mostly run by the Saudis, the Emiratis, and a little bit the Bahrainis, doesn't really achieve the objective. The Houthis are digging in. And since then, really, Yemen has been in a state of war one way or the other, really. And the Emiratis really becoming a part of that war, supporting officially the Saudi war effort against the Houthis. But if you see where the Emiratis how they enter the war and where they enter the war on the ground, particularly when they land in Aden in the south, it's quite clear that the Emiratis...
When you say they land?
Well, actually, they land. It was basically a very impressive military amphibious landing in Aden, which is something that in my recollection, no Arab state has done. I mean, no Arab military has been able to actually stage something like this. And
so this was the actual Emirati army.
Yeah, no, exactly. Emirati military coming in. Most people would say the Emirati military is the most efficient Arab military, as in terms of bang for buck, probably the best sort of military in the region. And they showed that they were quite good. They seized Aden, and much of the activity that the Emiratis engage in Yemen is not really about fighting the Houthis. They kind of leave the Saudis to it and let the Saudis really do all the heavy lifting there, because obviously that war is going on the border between Saudi and Yemen. The Qataris are helping in the south of Saudi Arabia on the border, supporting that, but they're not really getting into the war in Yemen. And then over 2015, the Emiratis are building. They're basically realizing that they're kind of out of their depth. And the transformational moment, I think, for the Emiratis, for their thinking about, again, commercial actors and how they should use commercial actors, was a strike. I think it was in September, in autumn 2015, a Houthi missile strike on an Emirati base in southern Yemen, which kills more than 50 Emirati soldiers. So it's the single most destructive, deadly event in the history of the Emirati military, which was a shocking moment. Most of the people who died were from the northern Emirates. They weren't from the south. So it also had a particular sort of flavor to it in the Emirates themselves, because people in the northern Emirates were saying, why is Abu Dhabi using us as cannon fodder? Certainly a transformational moment for the Emirates, where they're saying, okay, we can't continue the war at this current effort with a particular cost connected to it. So they're partially withdrawing, but they're not withdrawing from Yemen at all, completely. But what they had done, and they remembered that they had done that. So in the wake of the Arab Spring 2010, they had asked a very infamous gentleman called Erik Prince to set up shop in the Emirates to help out with securing oil infrastructure and whatnot, and potentially the regime if it ever came to an uprising in Abu Dhabi. So you already have that precedent. You have Erik Prince with his history, his vision, his philosophy in the country. You have mostly Latin American contractors who are based in the Emirates for security services, not for military war fighting. But the idea then was, why don't we use the capacity that we have there and build a much more offensive environment for these companies, where they're allowed to actually do war fighting as well, which is a big break in the direction and the trajectory that the industry was taking. Globally, the industry after Iraq and Afghanistan, they would provide security, they don't provide military services. And the Emiratis bring in the mercenaries and start delegating a lot of that war fighting in Yemen to mostly Colombians and other Latin American mercenaries that used to be based in the Emirates, and bring them into Yemen. They also bring some Israeli mercenaries in, and mercenaries from other countries.
And these guys are fighting the Houthis?
No, they're not fighting the Houthis. They're mostly in the business of fighting those who the Emiratis consider to be the threats to themselves.
To their commercial interests.
Well, it's about commercial, no, but there's an ideological component, because again, the narrative is we're fighting the Muslim Brotherhood. So we're going after those faction, Al-Islah itself, Al-Islah being a very powerful player and also party in Yemen, and being affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Islah in the UAE. The UAE is saying, oh, we're fighting the Muslim Brotherhood there. And so they're actually doing it. So they built up assassination squads that go after people, mercenaries going after individuals.
You can pick up So while the Saudis are fighting the Houthis in their Cold War with Iran, the Emiratis specifically have lent support to that rhetorically, but have gone in to kind of target who they see as their key enemy, which are Muslim Brotherhood interest groups.
Well, that's how it starts, but it goes after any. They're realizing that, first of all, they have a strategic interest in the littoral space, into the littoral waters, as well as the sort of the coastal areas of Yemen. They don't have any interest in northern Yemen, where it becomes very messy, where the terrain is very inaccessible, where fighting the Houthis is always going to be not an impossible task, but near impossible task, very similar to the sort of environment that you find in Afghanistan, if you look at the topography, the geography of the place. And so the Emiratis were saying, okay, we want to keep costs low, and we want to maximize bang for buck, if you will. And so the strategic value in Yemen really lies in Aden as a strategic port. but also the hinterland to that port is a logistical has a lot of logistical opportunities for the Emirati wider vision, which I would call mercantilist. I think Yemen has played a very important part in that, and so they're saying we can fight the Islamists here, we can fight any actor under the banner of fighting Islam. We can fight any actor politically, socio-politically, civil societal, who can become a threat to our vision of controlling the south of Yemen. And so they set up their own brigades of local Yemeni fighters, and they create that umbrella of the Southern Transitional Council, which is, still today a mostly Emirati-funded umbrella organization, which more or less neatly plugs into the grievances of Southerners in Yemen, who used to be part of Southern Yemen, who always had that since the reunification of Yemen in 1990, had that idea of reuniting, of basically seceding and bringing Southern Yemen back. So again, it's a very strong secessionist vision, very strong in terms of fighting political Islam and al-Islah, and at the same time, they want development, and the STC has their own fighting wing, and the Emiratis help them kind of build their own security sector and their own governance infrastructure in southern Yemen. And again, you create a non-state actor that operates as a proxy on the ground with a very strong indigenous narrative.
I mean, it sounds like from everything you're saying, and you've used the word mercantilist, right? And it sounds like there's two things that there's. And I think this epitomizes itself once we get to Sudan. But by all means, don't move to Sudan yet. Just if you have more things to say about Yemen, please do. But it sounds like the UAE is on this operation to sort of start this mercantilist mafia in countries where they can legitimately or illegitimately scapegoat the Muslim Brotherhood. But specifically, and this is more after Egypt, prey on like these countries that are now in massive instability because of fallout from the Arab Spring or for other reasons. I mean, is that more or less what you're saying?
So what I'm saying is, yes, instability after the Arab Spring.
Yes.
But also a geopolitical vacuum that nobody fills. The Americans are effectively withdrawn, but also giving a green light, both Obama and then later Trump 1 and Biden and Trump 2 again have, they follow a grand strategic path, which is consistent, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, in the way that they're saying the region isn't as important as it once was. We do want to keep a lid on further escalation, but managing the crises is great, but we don't want to do it. And the Gulf states can do it. And the Emiratis very much fill that void. They fill the void in the same way that Qatar, I think, filled that void directly after the Arab Spring. The counter-revolutionary sort of dynamic that I'm describing since 2013, that the Emiratis are leading, again happens within a vacuum where the Americans are saying, fair enough, as long as they create some sort of stability and we're not being dragged in, let them get on with it. And so they're letting it happen. And the Emiratis are very good at exploiting these vulnerabilities. And obviously, because they have the financial backing and the financial sort of means, they're able to kind of curate very effective sort of non-state actors on the ground. I should also mention when we talk about Yemen here, so we've got the Colombian mercenaries, we have delegation to local Yemeni factions, but there's a third component I think that becomes now very relevant as we talk about Sudan, is that obviously the Bashir government at the time, so Bashir still being the Sudanese president at the time, was trying to make some money, and he rented out, or Hemeti himself actually rents him out. But the RSF is a militia that used to come out of a man on horseback. The Janjaweed in Darfur in the early 2000s became very infamous for being involved in the Sudanese or Darfurian genocide. They become a semi-formal paramilitary group. Bashir gives them a status of a paramilitary group run by the family of Hemeti. And so Bashir and Hemeti think, how can we make some money? Let's rent out the capabilities of our militias to the Saudis, especially also to the Emiratis, to fight with them
like
in Yemen.
2016.
2015, 2016, they're offering their services to the Emiratis. So again, you see now what is happening. The Emirati military still being there, but the footprint is quite light after that event of losing more than 50 soldiers. And most of the fighting is done by locally Yemeni groups they're setting up, mercenary groups, as well as then the RSF-affiliated, Hemeti-affiliated sort of Sudanese fighters as well. And that is an important part of the broader network, because that connection is one that obviously becomes very relevant after 2019.
Okay, so I mean, I want to get to Sudan, but just before we get there, what's the current status of Yemen? I mean, like in terms of the Emirate footprint, and also just give us, I mean, as you mentioned, you kind of painted a picture of where both, I hate to use these terms, but East and Western Libya are. Like, what's the current status of Yemen, and how deeply entrenched are the Emiratis still? And I mean, because we now in the last 2 years, the Houthis have become very famous as the guys who are bombing Israel, and for a while they stopped the ships from going through. But I mean, there's a lot more that's going on. So we don't have a lot of time. Right. But just sort of like the 4-minute summary of the 4-minute summary, or like the 2-minute summary of what's the current status of Yemen.
No, Yemen is still highly divided. I mean, loads of fault lines. I think it's much more difficult to draw a map now of Yemen as it is like drawing a map of Libya, for example. It's a rig-rag of different spheres of influence. So the STC works together with the Hadi government, if you will, which is Saudi-backed, to kind of form the UN-backed government in Yemen. But that's only on paper. There is actually no united Yemeni government. You've got the Houthi government in the north that still sits in Sana'a, extremely repressive, obviously now very infamous for their striking of maritime shipping lanes, making them the baddies of the world in many ways, and obviously striking Israel, doing that fairly successfully. They've become, because of that war in Gaza and their response to it and the collapse of Hezbollah and weakening of Hamas, now they're kind of the pioneers on the front line for Iran's axis of resistance. That's happening in northern Yemen. In the south, the STC is really consolidating its power. I mean, they're officially backing the Saudi-backed government, but in reality, they're building their own networks. There's Zubaydi, who's their president of the STC, becomes an actor in his own right. The Emiratis, like with Haftar, they introduce him to the Russians, to the Chinese, to the Israelis. The STC is becoming the STC is becoming a quasi-state actor that is, though on paper hasn't succeeded yet, is in a process of practical gradual succession. And then we have disputed territories in the east, like Mahra, for example, where also the Omanis are being dragged in, the Saudis are being dragged in. What is important to note on Yemen, though, is that the Saudis have seen the Emiratis increasingly as a nuisance and as a competitor rather than a partner. So they entered the war in 2015 together, but for the Saudis today, the Emiratis are a nuisance and a competitor and a rival that undermines Saudi interests, because the Saudi interests are still in Yemen to keep the country united under one government, and the Emiratis very actively pushing the STC agenda, which is secessionist, which is about kind of dividing Yemen up into two. And so the Emiratis are certainly not making friends, and certainly are not contributing what we would consider to be regional stability.
Okay, I mean, I did say that's the last question before moving to Sudan, but there's a note that just sort of a follow up from what you've said. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the difference here is that in Libya, they have sort of funded and created Haftar's bastion. Mm-hmm. Right, and in Yemen, it's really a Saudi-led interventionist war, and the Emiratis have seized an opportunity, and now but it's also interesting because when we get to Sudan, we'll notice that there's also a cold war happening in Sudan between Egypt and yes, the Emiratis for geopolitical reasons. So they're running into these geopolitical fault lines as their adventurism kind of comes into play. Again, the question I want to ask, that was just a note, was again, what's the opportunity cost of, and in this case, it's not really the UAE-led intervention because it's Saudi. Yeah. But let's just imagine for the Saudi intervention, if the Saudis don't intervene as heavily as they do, I mean, maybe Yemen gets run by Houthis would be the Saudi propaganda remark, right? What's wrong and right about that?
No, first of all, one of the greatest things for the Emiratis are quite good usually. I mean, I think Sudan is a PR disaster, but until now they've been quite good at pushing their narrative. And one of the narratives they've been pushing is the Saudi-led war in Yemen. So most of the media have accused the Saudis for what's going on in Yemen. Right? They have used the Saudis as a kind of a front and cover to do their own activities. And you're still saying it's the Saudi-led war in Yemen. There is a Saudi-led war in Yemen. That Saudi-led war has ended, 5 years ago. The Saudis obviously still engaged and diplomatically. They're still using the Omanis as the main interlocutor to speak to the Houthis. But the Saudis are interested in a comprehensive deal that sees a united Yemen. Even sitting and speaking to the Houthis. It's the Houthis who don't want to come to the negotiation table. But the Emiratis are the spoilers in all of that. They don't want a consolidated Yemen. They would prefer two Yemens, and one that's fully under Abu Dhabi influence, or at least a Yemen that is divided, where it's a federalist state and there's a federal state of southern Yemen that's run by a pro-Emirati SDC. That's what they want. And that certainly runs diametrically counter to what the Saudis want to achieve. I mean, the opportunity cost here, I think, would be a Saudi. I think the Saudis hold most of the files. The Saudis have the strategic depth in Yemen. And I think the Saudis are pragmatic enough to engage all the other actors. I mean, the other actors who are, very important for Yemen is obviously Oman. The Saudis speak to the Omanis speak to the Saudis. I think the Omanis, they have their disagreements with Saudi Arabia, but on the whole, I think there could be a national dialogue could be had in Yemen where you bring the different factions together, including the Houthis. The Emiratis are staunchly opposed to it. They're opposed to a national dialogue.
Do you think they're the main reason why that's not happening?
I would say this is one of the main reasons. I think it's probably, maybe it is the main reason. It's one of the main reasons. The other main reason being Iran and the Houthis. Okay. So I think the biggest spoilers right now in Yemen is Iran and the UAE on opposite sides, really. But the SDC is not fighting the Houthis, and the Houthis are not fighting the SDC. It's really what's happening right now is the Saudis are being squeezed out. And that's how the Saudis would see it.
Okay, I mean, I'd love to actually go more about Yemen and everything else, but we need to move on. So Sudan.
Fast forward to Sudan. No, as I mentioned, so the Hemeti is this Janjaweed warlord leader in Darfur. Again, infamous for committing atrocities in the early 2000s, or at least his militia were involved in atrocities in Darfur. The Emiratis have invested in Sudan way before the revolution of 2018, 2019. So the Emiratis had seen Sudan as a breadbasket, for agricultural reasons. The UAE don't have a lot of arable land, so they for agricultural reasons wanted to have land and have invested into land and agriculture farming in Sudan. Also commodities. The Emiratis have, as I was saying, the MBZ's Emirates have grown as they've grown with their geostrategic power. They've also grown into the main gold trader, gold hub in the world. And Sudan obviously has a lot of gold. And so that relationship, as Dubai becomes more and more relevant, the UAE also invests heavily in Sudan and into gold and in commodity trade. And so most of Sudan's gold now is being exported legally or illegally through the UAE onto global markets. And the Hemeti family businesses are involved in that. And they have been involved for, way before Bashir actually fell. So the Emirati interest in Sudan predate the current setup, and they go back to the Bashir days, where the Emiratis thought Sudan has a lot to offer in terms of commodity, in terms of logistics, and agriculture as well. That being said, Bashir was someone who did run how would you call it? Certainly a dictatorship. It's a ideological military Islamist dictatorship, if you will. There were a lot of Islamist networks in the military, in the security sector that supported Bashir. So it's quite funny that the Emiratis were, while they were active pushing back against Islamists in Egypt and in Libya and in Yemen, they were quite happy to have a relationship with Bashir, who actually falls in the category of being another of their enemies. But they were quite pragmatic about it and really built that relationship with the Janjaweed militia, which then became the RSF. And so when we then fast forward to 2018, 2019, with the revolution happening in Sudan, the revolution is being captured by the military, the Sudanese armed forces, in partnership with the RSF. So the paramilitary group, the RSF, together with the SAF, basically capture it, create this transitional military council. At that time, the transition process seems to have been military-led. Again, something that the Emiratis like. The Emiratis like strongmen in uniform. I mean, we've seen that with Haftar, see that with Sisi. And so they initially get on well with Burhan, who's the leader of the SAF faction, but obviously they have that very intimate relationship with Hemeti. Most of their family money is in the UAE, so there's a very strong personal relationship between the Hemeti family and the UAE. If you look at the US Treasury and who they've listed and companies they've listed in the UAE and sanctioned, there are businesses, Sudanese businesses, all linked to Hemeti himself and his family. It's quite interesting. And so, during that revolution, and then the years following, the Emiratis become with the Saudis together, become a main backer of that military transition, hoping that they can squeeze the Islamists out. It was all about making sure the Islamists don't come to power and they can't exploit that revolution. So they said, let's build them a military dictatorship. So in 2019, 2020, they kind of give it a civilian sort of look by having the Prime Minister Hamdok as a civilian leader. But that was more of a front, when in reality what was built was a military dictatorship of RSF and SAF working together. 2021, we see a coup happening after COVID, or we could say during COVID, where the military fully takes over. All the achievements, which was a people-led revolution in Sudan, all these achievements were undone. The military takes over with quite a lot of repression, the RSF being extremely repressive. And that goes on for another 1-2 years until 2023, when April we see the RSF staging a coup from within that military dictatorship against the SAF. And that kind of leads us to the civil war that we're in now, which for the last 2.5 years has probably created the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And I'm saying that at a time when we have that terrible genocide going on in Gaza. So, all of that together. And the Emiratis have not just emerged out of a sudden as the main backer of the RSF. They have been the main backer of the RSF, at least, for the last 15 years, if not longer. And so the RSF today, over the last 2 years, has really been the most atrocious of two very atrocious opponents. I think we have to be very clear about this. Just because we speak out against the RSF, and just because most of the media and most of Western governments speak out against the RSF and the atrocities that they're committing, they're not speaking out on behalf of Burhan and the SAF as being the savior in all of that. I mean, they were very instrumental in undermining the revolution and creating a military dictatorship, and Burhan is certainly not an angel in all of that. But obviously, in terms of atrocities, though, the atrocity, the violence against civilians, against women, against children, mass killings, really in the most brutal way you can possibly imagine, and then broadcasting that onto social media, that sort of stuff we've seen mostly or only been done by the RSF. So the accusations now of genocide against the RSF, and obviously the UAE being implicated in that because they're the main financial and military and logistical backer of the RSF.
Okay, it may seem like a basic question, but I think it's for me, but also for the audience. Clarify for me why exactly the Emiratis were supporting the Janjaweed 15 years ago. And then obviously in the last 4 or 5 years, and the history may go beyond that, but the issue of helping RSF-backed generals and others smuggle gold into Dubai, where it's then legalized. So just explain the whole gold connection, because I think that's very important. But then also, what's the legacy? Like, why would the UAE, when they're trying to, some would say legitimately, buy some land in Sudan to help its agriculture and set up commodity buying, etc., which is what states do. Why would they, start supporting the Janjaweed? And beyond the answer, and maybe this is the answer, that the Janjaweed were going to be a counterbalance to Bashir.
Yes.
So yeah.
Now, Bashir, and the accusation here is, and I heard this, Emiratis saying the justification of why they're backing the Janjaweed or the RSF as opposed to Burhan, who they did back in the past, is that Burhan is still penetrated by the remnants of these Islamist Bashir-era Islamist networks. Very little evidence for that. I mean, Burhan is not an Islamist, but certainly Hemeti isn't. I mean, Hemeti is a very firm anti-Islamist ideologue. But I think Sudan is only peripherally about values and ideological. I think it's really about hard interests. It is about gold. It is about commodities. And so the Janjaweed, the RSF, and Hemeti himself, this warlord, becomes so instrumental because he has the access. He captures the most important gold mines in Sudan. So if you want to rise up as the leading gold capital of the world, which is Dubai, you do want to have access to these resources. So it was really about minerals and commodities.
So from then.
So much of that gold trade starts, from then, and its family business, its business is tied to Hemeti, who are involved in it, and they're Emirati-based logistics companies who bring the gold in. It's melted down, and what we have is a beautiful carousel now, where gold leaves Sudan, is being translated into cash, laundered, if you will. That cash in any form, whether it's cash or crypto, can then be translated in the UAE in a value chain with which you can actually purchase weapons, and these weapons then go back into Sudan. Another thing that, I just very briefly alluded to is the fact that the Emiratis have become also the major backer of Wagner Group, the Russian mercenary group, which is a network of different companies. It's not just a mercenary battalion. I mean, these are different companies providing security and military services for the Russians. But they're also a commodity trading network. There are a lot of different logistics companies involved and commodity trading companies. If you unpack some of the companies and their links to Russia, they're always also linked to especially when they operate in Africa, they're always also linked to the UAE. They either use the UAE as a jurisdiction where they have their local headquarters, or they use Emirati firms for logistical support to fly in, flying material, into Africa, and especially Sudan, and flying gold out of Africa. So there's some gold mines in Sudan who've been operated by Wagner affiliated commodity traders and companies and Hemeti. So there is a link between Wagner, UAE, and Hemeti. And so it's a very complex network of networks of different corporations and companies that predates the revolution in Sudan, which then makes it all about commercial interests. But beyond that, I mean, why are the Emiratis so interested in becoming the main conduit for Wagner Group at the time when we're fighting the war in Ukraine against Wagner, against the Russians, is because it makes the UAE relevant. I mean, going back to the point that they're a small state aspiring to become a middle power. If you are the main conduit for the great power of Russia to get access to Africa, then you are irreplaceable, indispensable. And that's what the Emiratis have achieved for themselves. And the Wagner story doesn't start in Sudan. It starts again in Libya, right? And it was again the Emiratis who paid initially for it. Was Emirati money that brought Wagner into Libya in 2019. So this all happens in parallel while we talked before about Yemen and other places. In parallel, the Emiratis are using that hub of Haftar in Libya to build a base from which they can then channel arms, fighters, non-state actors into sub-Saharan Africa, including in Sudan. So all of that is happening at a time when nobody really cares about Sudan, right? Nobody knows what's going on in Sudan. Most people who look at the Middle East don't even care about Sudan. I think way before we see the images that we're seeing today, where everyone does care about Sudan, the Emiratis are already there. They implanted themselves, again, through corporate networks. And the interesting thing about this carousel is that it's not just Sudan, UAE, it's also Sudan, UAE, Libya. So in 2020, in COVID, when everyone here around the world was thinking about the first lockdown and this new virus coming, nobody paid attention to anything else. The Emiratis flew, I think, 60 plane loads worth of weapons into eastern Libya, into Haftar territory, that then is still unaccounted for. Some of it was probably used by the LNA. But apart from that, what's most likely, and we can trace some of where these weapons ended up in Sudan. So you have Haftar building a massive arms depot with Emirati supplied weaponry, and then uses his own logistics to basically channel these arms into Chad and into Darfur and into Sudan. And so all this is connected. And all of it, again, if you look at what the one connecting piece in all of this is, it's Abu Dhabi or the UAE. It's the one jurisdiction that in Africa is indispensable for commodity trading, for private logistics companies, for mercenarism and private security, and obviously agricultural stuff and also some other mineral trade. But the UAE are the key hub in all of that. In any of these conflicts in the Horn of Africa or in Sub-Saharan Africa, you will find an Emirati angle to it.
I want to speak a bit about the Wagner Group and sort of how, the Emiratis being a conduit for Russian interests, how that rubs up against their relationship with the USA. Mm-hmm. But before that, I mean, as we've been doing with Libya and Yemen, what's the opportunity cost of non-UAE involvement? What would have happened to Sudan specifically if the UAE weren't funding the Janjaweed for the last 15 years and developing that relationship? Just how devastating has that relationship been for Sudan?
Extremely devastating over the last 2 years, obviously. But I think we have to go back in time, going back to the revolution. I think without Saudi and Emirati money and backing for the Transitional Military Council that consisted of RSF and the SAF, I don't think we would have seen, the squashing of this liberal people's mobilization in Sudan. I think the revolution could have taken a very different shape. We might have seen even a civilian government emerging. So I think that's where it really starts. That's where I would start blaming Saudi Emirati involvement for that, which was very, very counterproductive. And I do think the Saudis have quite a lot of regrets now that they were part of that in 2019. But obviously the backing of the RSF has taken a much more sinister turn in the fact that, we're now having a genocide. I mean, the atrocities that are being... Creating a repressive regime is one thing, but creating a militia and funding a militia, sustaining a militia in what can only be described as a genocidal campaign in Darfur and in Sudan is obviously, that's only possible because the Emiratis are still funding it. There's no way that the RSF, obviously the RSF has, again, goes back to the wider network regionally. The RSF was in Yemen, as I said before, paid for by the Emiratis. They brought some of the weapons back into Sudan, obviously, so some weapons were available. But the logistical support that they're having, the monetary support that they're having, because again, all the commodity, the gold laundering means the RSF has quite a lot of money. Hemeti is now a billionaire. They are getting PR support as well from various entities, from various information networks that the Emiratis are having, whether these are media companies or social media bots and trolls. So all that backing makes the RSF extremely potent. And then beyond that, their access to drones and high tech makes a huge difference against the SAF, which is obviously a state military that has an air force. And the fact that the RSF has now its own air force, unmanned, and nobody knows who's flying these drones. I mean, some people suggest it might be Emiratis, could be mercenaries that are being provided through the UAE to the RSF. That means the RSF is no longer just a militia on horseback. I mean, they're actually high-tech warriors, if you will, using high-tech against the SAF. And so without Emirati support, we wouldn't have the stalemate that we're in right now. I mean, the SAF would have been able to win this war quite quickly against the RSF. But the Emiratis have created effectively a military stalemate.
What do you do you think that stalemate is ongoing? Do you think the Emiratis have overreached? Because obviously we're discussing, I mean, to a large extent, we're discussing the Emiratis now because of the actions in Sudan. Yeah. They clearly have gotten a lot of bad rap and PR, which they've managed to successfully evade for a long period of time. So, I mean, how is that horrible conflict, can it be reined in some way? And do you think it will?
No, again, it goes back to the United States. There's one terrible trace or characteristic, attribute, whatever you want to call it, that the Emiratis have. It's part of their strategic culture. I mean, you need to understand Abu Dhabi in particular, the Bani Yas, which is the original tribe from which the Al Nahyan come from. They come from the inland of Arabia, right? They're Bedouin tribes from the inland. They're very different from the tribes who were living on coastal areas like in Dubai, for example, or in Qatar, or other parts of Arabia, who are more pragmatic, who are more tolerant, more open-minded. The Bedouins, the Bani Yas of Abu Dhabi, were the opposite of that. It was all about masculinity. It was force. It was very transactional, never very transformational. And they're very transactional in the way that if you hit them once, they'll try to hit you double as hard. Everything is about retaliation. It's about pushing back against resistance, even if it's not smart. It's not acting and this is what we're seeing right now with all that criticism that's being thrown at the Emiratis from all angles, from Western partners, from the media, where instead of acknowledging that they've made a mistake, instead of acknowledging that this is not going anywhere, they're doubling down. Instead of backing down, they're basically doubling down. And that is part of that mentality where they feel like they can sustain the pressure because they think they can still win. And winning for the Emiratis looks very different from how we would describe traditionally a victory where you're trying to basically capture an entire country, you control it, you put your flag on top of the presidential palace and say, we won this war, mission accomplished. That's not how the Emiratis play. So if you then again go back to Yemen, you go back to Libya, you realize what the Emiratis have done. They are trying to create a situation where they're the most important player at the table. Doesn't mean they need to put their flag anywhere. As long as the RSF is there so deeply ingrained in the conflict that they can't be unseated and without them being pushed out entirely, then the RSF basically provides the Emirati with a sort of victory, because the Emiratis are now indispensable. The Emiratis are at this negotiation table. Nobody can speak to the RSF. So if you wanted a consolidated, negotiated settlement of the war in Sudan, the UAE will have to play a part in that. It's the same tactic they've been playing in Libya, where they're so deeply invested in Haftar. Haftar has been so deeply ingrained now in the fabric locally in Libya that no negotiated settlement over Libya can exclude Haftar. So this is how victory looks like for the UAE. So they're not going to give this up. What they're trying to do now is trying to convince the Americans that only Abu Dhabi can actually bring all the parties together, and they will provide the Trump administration with their 10th, 11th, 12th victory. And Trump is after the next war that he solved. So Sudan might be the next one, and the Emiratis are promising him, we'll just get it done, and then we'll create a stalemate from which we have a better bargaining position. We'll bring everyone around the table, and then we'll create a peace in Sudan. That's what the Americans are being promised, and that's why the Americans and the Trump administration are not really calling out the Emiratis at this point.
Okay. So, I mean, we've mentioned, I told you about, want to discuss by being a conduit for Russia, they're rubbing up against the Americans. They're rubbing up against the Saudis in Yemen. They're rubbing up, we haven't discussed why, but they're rubbing up, we can discuss it now, against the Egyptians because of what's happening in Sudan. When you take all of this into context, then first just explain to us what the issue is with Egypt and Sudan and the UAE. But is this overreach on a broader way? And when you think about all of these things, who is their biggest ally? And I mean, I guess the answer comes, maybe it's Israel. Explain to us why, if that is your answer, or if it isn't, why that is the case or is not the case, just as a natural allyship, and why they're allies. I mean, you've kind of mentioned already that it's because right in the start, before we mentioned all the details, right, that Israel would hate Arab Street, which is more representative, and the UAE have been actively working against that. But is there something beyond that, or is that still the heart of the relationship?
Now, the very complex questions. And the Israeli Emirati relationship obviously again predates the Abraham Accords. I mean, they've been under the table relations for a while. There's an ideological alignment. That's, I think, how it starts. The idea that for the Israelis, they like Arabs when they are contained, when they have full control over civil society, and obviously they fear the Palestinian cause more than anything, traditionally. And so the Emiratis have always been, if not opposed to the Palestinian cause, then at least they never were supporters of the Palestinian cause, especially Abu Dhabi has not. It's something that they care about, but not deeply. And they're very happy to contain any sort of pro-Palestine mobilization, and they've been able to clamp down on it in the UAE, quite funnily, since the 7th of October. But the ideological alignment is about fear of political Islam. Both of them share that. Fear of the Arab Street. Both of them share that. Israel is also a country that supplies a very, very relevant military and security technology, especially in the AI and high-tech space. The Emiratis want to get access to it. They did get access to it. If you want to build a police state that controls its own people and their minds, then you need to have that sort of Israeli technology tested on Palestinians. And so again, Emiratis have invested into that, and they've been buying Israeli technology. The Israelis, what they need from the Emirates is strategic depth. They now, for the first time, are able to build sort of hubs in the UAE that allows them to have direct proximity to other Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar, Oman, Yemen, but also project out into the Indian Ocean. So strategically relevant. We've seen relationships being built between the Israelis and the Emiratis in Yemen, where allegedly Israelis are now have been seen, especially people in the signal intelligence in various islands off the coast of Yemen. So the Israelis are using the Emiratis as conduits to get access to territories Israelis never had traditionally access to. So that is very relevant, and that's why it's an interdependent relationship where both sides are winning, and it's probably more about. And then Israel ultimately wants investments. They want money, FDI. The Emiratis initially were able to bring a couple of billions of dollars of investments into Israel. That has mostly been frozen since the 7th of October because the Emiratis are very conscious that this relationship with Israel has been extremely unpopular in the wider Arab world, but also domestically, despite the fact that they're controlling their own public, despite the fact they've built a police state. They have not been able to contain that domestic criticism and dissent against that relationship with the Israelis.
Okay, and then just to clarify for us why why the Emiratis are upsetting Sisi with the actions in Sudan.
Now, the relationship with Egypt is a complicated one, but one that's easily explained. So Sisi obviously owes his success to the Emiratis. So that's certainly a long-standing relationship. But beyond that, the Emiratis have been a major backer since Sisi came into power. They put billions of dollars into the Egyptian economy. And I think Sisi has become, like I said before, a beggar state. He's very much reliant and dependent on that money flow, and he keeps on begging. He needs bailouts, and again, the Emiratis usually step up to the occasion and put money into Egypt. And so there is a relationship which is very difficult for the Egyptians to sustain, because on the one hand, their president comes and begs them begs the Emiratis for money, while the Emiratis working against Egyptian interests on all corners. So on the Libyan side, the Haftar relationship that initially the Egyptians supported, but the relationship between Haftar and the UAE is a major concern for border security on the western side of Egypt. In the south, the Emiratis are working with Ethiopia, key rival of the Egyptians. They're working with the RSF against the SAF, RSF being a major rival of the Egyptians and the SAF being a key partner for the Egyptians. On the eastern side, if you look into the Sinai, the Emiratis working with the Israelis. Again, the Israelis have become obviously a major threat on the eastern flank for the Egyptians. So in any conflict that surrounds currently and occupies the debate on national security in Egypt, the Emiratis are on the opposite side of it. And at the same time, the Emiratis are putting money in, so Sisi can't afford to actually call them out because he's really reliant on their cash. And it makes him look weak. And in the face of a lot of Egyptians who are proud being Egyptians, they feel like not only have we become a beggar state, but we're begging, and at the same time we're being someone is kicking us under the table, which is the Emiratis from all angles.
Okay, so I mentioned earlier on, so they're rubbing up against the Saudis and the US. Chiefly because these are the powers who, and Israel as well, but they're not really rubbing up against Israel, who could exercise the most leverage on them. So how are they managing that relationship? And do you think do you think their statecraft and the way the trajectory has gone on is sustainable, given that this is going to foment, or has been? It's also not fomenting a relationship with Saudi Arabia. There's parts that are good for the Saudis and not. And I guess it's similar with the US. But just what's your analysis on how these three actors are going to kind of figure out the region?
So Abu Dhabi is obviously pursuing strategic autonomy, right? They're saying we're picking and choosing. We have a very deep-seated relationship with America, but there's a lot of things we disagree with America on. They want more support from the US that they're not getting. Hence why they've built that relationship with Russia, which has been very problematic for a lot of Western partners, also for the United States. They've built a deep-seated tech relationship with China, again, something that the Americans don't necessarily like. They've built relationship with non-state actors in Africa that the Americans don't necessarily like. When I say the Americans, especially the institutions, the military. The Trump administration is more agnostic about it because they don't really care about anything. It's really about its domestic policy. Foreign policy is a tool to basically, tick boxes and either get a Nobel Peace Prize or get a medal, or say we solved another war, makes him look good. And so as long as the Emiratis make Trump look good through cash injections in the United States or by offering him an off-ramp in Sudan that then Trump can claim as I solved the war in Sudan, I think that's all Trump really cares about. So the thing is, the Emiratis have created a web of interdependence. That's really what it's all about. I call this network-centric statecraft. All these corporate networks have created an interdependent relationship where the Emiratis have a relationship with all the key players in this part of the world. So the Americans are interested in a player that can give them access. And the Emiratis can give access to various players. And I think that is a sustainable part of their strategy. I think in Sudan, the public pressure and the atrocities by the RSF have been very counterproductive to that. I think they're now being called out. The Emiratis have to now make a decision whether they want to double down or back down. My guess is they're not going to back down, and they will try to translate this current achievement in Darfur on the battlefield into a potential stalemate that then can produce a diplomatic off-ramp. The question is whether the SAF and Burhan wants to be instrumentalized in that way or not, but that's how they're selling it, at least to the Americans. Europe doesn't matter to the UAE. The UAE see Europe as a bunch of small and middle powers equal to themselves, and they play hardball. They play hardball with the UK. They play hardball with the French. And if they don't get their way, they use whatever leverage they have. And it's quite significant because UAE is still a country that has, that is a very important producer of energy. Europe is very much energy dependent on the region, and Europe needs investments, and that's something that the UAE can deliver. So I think in terms of levers of power, I would say the UAE is in a more powerful position than the Europeans in that bargaining situation. Plus, the Europeans don't have any networks anymore in Africa or the Middle East, so they are overly reliant on these partners in the Gulf, particularly the UAE, to unlock some of these problems.
Okay, we've covered a lot, and I just want to kind of start wrapping this up. But I think it's obviously we mentioned the genocide in Gaza. The Abraham Accords, these are big issues, obviously, and the Abraham Accords have been around since Trump's first in office from like 2019. So just, I mean, how do you think I mean, we know the Emirates' position on the genocide in Gaza. They've probably less than any other Arab nation said the least, right? And they've been the most supportive of Israel in terms of diplomatic ties and everything else.
Yeah.
Probably not with the exception, but a close second is Morocco. So where do you think how do you think the genocide impacts the Emirates? It sounds like it doesn't. I mean, outside of bad reputation or PR problems. But I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. That genocide has not yet stopped. We're not sure if Trump's plan is going to come to fruition at all, or if it does come to fruition just in namesake, but not. It seems unlikely it will be in any sort of reality form.
Yeah.
There's talk that there may be an international force. There's a discussion happening where Turkey may start committing troops. I'm sure the Turks would want that. I'm not sure if the Israelis would actually allow it to happen. I'm not sure if Trump has the sustainability to the interest to make sure it does happen. So I mean, we have to address those things specifically, but just where does the still unknown outcome of this horrible action in genocide, where will that leave the Emirates' position?
I think Gaza has fundamentally undermined the UAE's standing in the region. I think the Abraham Accords were obviously among Arabs always contested because there was never an angle that helped the Palestinians. It was never about Palestine. It was always about UAE and Israel. It was very US centric. It has been and remains an out of jail card for the Emiratis in Washington. We shouldn't underestimate that. Any criticism that anybody brings, legitimate or not, against the Emiratis, whether it's their funding of Wagner or their support for the RSF or their relationship with China, which are all concerns for most American policymakers, lawmakers, many of them are saying, okay, yes, it's not great, but let's not forget they're the only ones who have that relationship with Israel. And Israel still, AIPAC and the pro-Israel lobby in America is still extremely powerful. And so the UAE have been able to piggyback along the Israel lobby, and that's been very, very successful. And I think there's this trade-off where the Abraham Accords have undermined the reputation of the UAE in the region, certainly since 2023 and the 7th of October and Israeli action in Gaza, where the Emiratis are nowhere to be seen as a critical actor. I think they've made the annexation of the West Bank the kind of red line now. They've established and said that is not going to happen, although de facto Israel is already doing land grabs. But overall, the Emiratis have not found a position that allows them to actually leverage the Abraham Accords in any way to create an outcome that would help the Palestinian people, or and for that matter, let's say we don't care about Palestine, but creating an outcome that's good for regional stability. Because after all, Israeli action against Qatar, Israeli action against Iran were all things that were detrimental to Iranian interests as well. I mean, the UAE initially liked a bit of degradation of Hamas, the degradation of Hezbollah, a bit of degradation of Iran, but within means. And so this completely unhinged Netanyahu government that is going to lash out. I don't know how many wars they were involved in. I mean, they've been striking Yemen, striking Syria, Lebanon, obviously
Yemen,
Palestine,
Tunisia.
Yes, Tunisia, exactly. I mean, they've been so, and Iran as well, and Qatar. If you look at that, I mean, that's not in the Emirati interest. That is the sort of uncontrollable instability that the Emiratis don't want. So, but they haven't been able to use that leverage, not in Washington and not with the Israelis, to actually achieve an outcome that favors them. And even on Gaza, yes, the UAE are leading on humanitarian aid, but that's because they have that special relationship where they can get stuff through the gate in Gaza, because the Israelis are allowed to go in while they don't allow others to put humanitarian aid in. But that's about the extent of it. After all, it was Qatar who really brought this war to. Yeah, I mean, it's not to an end. I mean, it's still ongoing.
They made sure the discussion occurred between the right people.
Yes, at least they put people together, and I think the first step was taken. Emirates were nowhere to be seen. And even now, when we talk about the international security force in Gaza, where the Emiratis initially said we will contribute forces, now they're saying we won't until there's a framework in place, which there isn't. Trump is not really doing anything to move this whole process forward to the next stage. So the Abraham Accords are still a great out-of-jail card, I think, in Washington. That's what it was meant to be and meant to do. But Israel, an unhinged Israel now, is for the Emirates, and that's what the Emiratis are saying increasingly, just as bad for regional security as is Iran. So for them, they're two pariah states. And that's kind of where the Gulf consensus now is, where the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states are trapped in a sandwich between two pariahs, Israel and Iran. And that's how the Emiratis look at it as well. But the Emiratis have not done anything to sever relations with Israel. I mean, the Abraham Accords are in place. Yes, some of the diplomats have been called back. But after all, the Abraham Accords are still there. And I think any Emirati you speak to will tell you they're currently not negotiating an exit, or they're not using it as leverage. I think they will leave it as it is.
I mean, it makes sense for them to leave it as it is, because then they see it as the partner that's still most likely to go for it. So I guess then they can use their exit as leverage as opposed to their default being in it as leverage. Yes. I mean, in the last 2 years, I think many people watching what's been happening in Gaza and thinking, how can the Israelis get away with this, have had, I mean, two questions in their mind. Who's leading who? Is it the Israelis and AIPAC, as you know, John Mersheimer has been one of the most foremost people putting forth this position that the Israelis have completely bought Washington and they can do what they like, and so reluctantly or unreluctantly, depending on who you are in Washington, you go along with it. A more, traditional idea is that Israel is an imperial extension of the USA's policy, and is, fomenting instability in the region, which suits the US imperial ambitions. Yeah. It seems like just listening to you that a lot of Abu Dhabi's behavior is independent, autonomous. Obviously, they do consider real politics and how people are going to respond to it, but I mean, where do you stand on that discussion now? How much of this do you think is Washington allowing Abu Dhabi and Israel to go ahead and do what they want? Because at the end of the day, while it may be a bit inconvenient, these are their chaotic interventions are sort of in our interests. Or do you think Washington is getting very concerned about these two actors and what they're doing, and are really trying to, especially the Pentagon and the military and the strategists, we need to really try to create an intervention and a pivot? What do you think?
Well, I mean, there's a difference between different institutions in Washington, right?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, if you call it the deep state, as in the establishment, the formal institutions of Washington, the military, those who are involved in military and security policy, security and foreign policy and strategy, obviously see this as a problem. They see the Emirati activities in Africa as a problem. They see their partnering with Wagner in Russia as a problem. But the Emiratis have been trying to emulate the Israeli approach, which is capturing Washington not by formal institutional relationships, but by informal networks of, lobbyists, think tankers, people who can shape the narrative close to the White House, that whoever's in the White House will be basically, their perception will be shaped by the Emiratis. And they've been quite successful at it. I think they, after Israel, they've been really creating a second lobby that was very powerful. The only thing is that most of that power still lies with the Israelis, because the Emiratis have invested into the same outlets that the Israelis have invested in, whether it's the same think tanks, because they share the same fear about political Islam and Arabs more generally, or the Arab street, if you will. And so the UAE can't use that network they've built in Washington independently, because the Israelis already subverted the same network. They shared that network. And so that makes the Emiratis slightly less powerful when they want to use this network against Israel, hence they haven't. I think what we've seen, though, is an emerging Gulf lobby that is somewhat independently operating. That includes the Qatari networks, the Saudi networks, some of the Emirati networks. And I think they have been very, very powerful in pushing back some of the most extremist thinking and narratives that the Israelis have tried to inject into Washington. And we're seeing a pushback now. I think America First and the MAGA crowd, very anti-Israel, for good reason, because of what Israel is doing and how they're abusing the Americans, how Israel has become somewhat the tail that's wagging the dog. that's not the case with the Emiratis. The Emiratis are not a tail that is wagging the American dog. They are just more strategically autonomous in some respects. I think they're more strategically autonomous than Israel, actually, quite funnily enough. So autonomous in the way, obviously, both Israel and the UAE get most of their weaponry from the United States. They still rely, but the Emiratis are still a net contributor to American power, I would say, as are the other Gulf states. I mean, UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia put trillions of dollars into the United States, so they're a great investor. But they also absorb a lot of the burden that the Americans don't want to share anymore, that they don't want to burden anymore. They share this burden with these Gulf states, and they're absorbing it. That's great for American power. And so most policymakers in America look at the Gulf states as a willing pawn, as someone that they can work through or work alongside. Israel, on the other hand, is no longer that sort of country that absorbs the burden. It's actually creating burden for the United States. And I think we've now been at this tipping point where the old narrative of AIPAC and the pro-Israel lobby of saying they're an extension of American power in the region and they're helping us to do things that we don't want to do. This narrative no longer holds. And in Washington, people are questioning it because actually it's the contrary. It's Israel that is dragging and has been dragging the United States into consecutive wars, whether it's now against Iran, Hezbollah, and whatnot. But dragging them into wars in Iraq. Netanyahu, in particular, has been on the record for decades of engaging neocons. So I think the Gulfies in general are seen as a more long-term, a more favorable partner to the United States, because not only are they paying for their own kit, but they're also putting money into the United States and help the United States absorbing some of that regional burden. And the problem here is not the Gulfies or the Israelis. It's a reluctant United States, unwilling to lead on the Middle East. Some people say it's a good thing. Most people, I personally think the neoconservatives, neocons of the Bush years and following were the most destructive force in the Middle East. So good for them not to invest anymore in the Middle East and leading policy on the Middle East. The problem, though, is it leaves a vacuum that nobody is credibly filling. We don't want the Iranians to fill it. We don't want the UAE to fill it, and they can't. So we're left with this kind of mishmash and extremely networked order that is extremely fragile. And the US, I don't think, is not coming back.
When you say coming back, they're not going to invest further in the region.
They will lead from behind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It seems, as you mentioned the vacuum, and you mentioned this a few times, it's Abu Dhabi seems to be filling all the vacuums, or at least they're trying to.
They're trying
that's their goal. We started off this discussion. Not exactly, but it was mentioned in the first 10-15 minutes about how, Qatar were kind of pushing for the reform that the Arab Spring was going to bring, or the revolutions were going to bring, and were heavily invested in that, and seemed to be doing, I wouldn't say successful, but it was definitely playing to their interest in the start, or at least what their hopes were, not their interest necessarily. And now it seems like Abu Dhabi is on top. How is it? Is it just a case of Tamim and Hamad, the change that happened there? How influential was the siege that the Gulf nations put on Qatar in 2017 on that? Is it just a case of building or trying reform is just a lot more difficult than funding militias and being destructive? How do you think that Qatar have been outplayed?
Ask the Iranians and the Russians. Disruption is always much easier than building something, like creating something. Creating stability is much more difficult than creating chaos. But I think the Qataris themselves, they would tell you that they have transitioned in their mindset from where they were during the Arab Spring. That is certainly Tamim as opposed to Hamad, but it's also the lesson learned. The Qataris quite early on, if you think about it now, the counter-revolution, let's say, started in 2013, 12 years ago. The Emiratis are still not learning any lesson. They continue on that trajectory. The Qataris learned after 2 years of experimenting during the Arab Spring that it wasn't going to work and that it will upset the region and that it will create instability. And then they basically course-corrected and did a U-turn. The Saudis did it in Yemen after a couple of years, realized not going anywhere. They U-turned, course-corrected. The Emiratis haven't course-corrected yet. I think the Emiratis still continue on that trajectory. I think the Gulf crisis or the Qatar blockade, which was UAE-led essentially, for the reasons that we outlined, basically, because Qatar was seen as a major sponsor of the revolutionary trend. I think that was the first and one of the biggest defeats for the Emiratis. The fact that essentially Qatar didn't back down. They continued on their policy. Overall, they continued to be the country that they have been throughout. It was the Emiratis who had to basically come down and turn a little bit. I think after the Al-Ula Accords, which brought the Gulfies back together, were a big turning point, especially now because the countries are no longer not isolated. They're actually the most included in all discussions. It's now the Saudis and the Emiratis who don't get along over Sudan, over Yemen, and even over Syria. And it's the Qataris and the Saudis who work together on Syria, for example, and even on Gaza. And the UAE are the odd one out. So I think, what happened after the Al-Ula and after the failed blockading of Qatar is that the UAE have become more sidelined in some issues. Obviously, they're still part of a lot of the discussion in the Middle East and Gulf discourse. But the Emiratis are no longer, they're certainly not omnipotent, and they have been confronted with the limits of their power. But it hasn't stopped what I call the axis of secessionist across the region to operate, because all of that has been delegated. It's a network that's self-sustaining, which isn't based on Emirati capacity and Emirati formal institutions. It's private networks that the Emiratis are running. That's their greatest source of power, and that's what I'm saying. And these networks penetrate all aspects of the region in a way that none of the other countries have even networks like this. They are at the table in most of the conflicts, or at the table of most of the conflicts in a way that the UK isn't, for example, or France isn't, or the European Union isn't, or even the Americans aren't. And that is influence. It might not be hard power, but it's influence. And that influence is something that makes the Emiratis certainly a force to reckon with. And I think they have an opportunity on Sudan to U-turn and still come out on top in all of these other conflicts.
Okay, final question. I remember reading probably about 8 or 9 or 10 years ago, just as when MBS first came on the scene, and he was still the crown prince. He's the crown prince, but before he was even the crown prince. It was MBS is modeling himself as MBZ. I think that era is now gone. I think MBS is now his own person. I think he is much younger, naturally speaking. Saudi Arabia is a much bigger and richer country than the Emirates. What do you think? I mean, both personality-wise, but also because of just natural geopolitical clashing. What do you think the future of the Saudi and Emirati relation? Like, where do you think this relationship will be in the year 2040 or 2050? Where do you think it's going?
Well, with developments in AI, I don't know where we're all going to be in the year 2050, to be honest. So I'm not going to make predictions. It's very difficult to make predictions about this. But I would definitely say that the trajectories that both countries are on, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are increasingly rubbing against each other. And so it's gone from competition to rivalry, back to competition, but it's going to continue along a trajectory of sometimes it will be rivalry where they're going head to head, sometimes it will be just competition, because they're also competing in the same economic space. I mean, Saudi Arabia is they need FDI, they need foreign direct investments, they need an opening up of the economy. They're also betting on technology and AI in the same way that the Emiratis are, but the Emiratis have that infrastructure that the Saudis don't have. The Emiratis have a much more agile market and a private sector, much more agile than the Saudis. They have a bureaucracy that's more agile in the UAE than the Saudis. So it's a competition that the Saudis will find very difficult to compete in. Yes, Saudi Arabia has the PIF, the Public Investment Fund, which is underwritten by the biggest oil company, energy company in the world, Aramco, which is still a very powerful tool. But their interests are, they're not in this space, they're not diametrically opposed, but they're zero-sum interests. So it's very difficult to create win-win situations in this space. And the Emiratis are, as I said before, their Bedouin mindset is extremely competitive and confrontational. The Saudis, of course, obviously, they also have their own legacy of being Bedouin, but it's more complicated than that, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is generally a country that is trying to find, obviously they are confrontational at times, but then they learn their lesson and they usually back down under pressure. The Emiratis Abu Dhabi has shown that they don't back down. And so I think that relationship is what used to be a bromance between MBZ and MBS. That time is certainly gone. So, once MBS becomes king, it will be a very different dynamic. And I think the power that, again, there is an opportunity in UAE being ostracized at the moment by the rest of the region. If Saudi could fill that space through leadership, through vision, particularly on Palestine, I think that could really push the Saudis onto the next level, where most Arab and Muslim countries will affiliate themselves with Saudi Arabia, not with the UAE, because the UAE appears to be on the wrong side of history on this, especially on Sudan. So, and hence why we're seeing so many Saudi commentators pushing back against the Emiratis in a way that we haven't seen. I mean, Saudi social media is full of criticism of the UAE, especially over Sudan, but also over Yemen. So that competition is going to continue. Where it's going to lead, I don't know, because we don't know. I don't know where the region will be in 20 years' time. So many, unknown unknowns.
Okay, cool. Andreas Krieg, thank you so much for your time. I feel like we've discussed a lot, but we also have not discussed so much. We haven't even discussed Syria, for example, which I think is arguably possibly the most interesting thing given everything that's happened there in the last year. With the exception of possibly that, I mean, it's really hard. It's there's a region that's so much happening. But I mean, I'd love to have you here again to discuss a bunch of things, possibly even with other people. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
It's been a good 2 hours or so. And best of luck with everything that you do.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.